In the year 167 BC, before the autumn harvest, countless messengers departed from Chang'an, the capital of the Han Empire. They carried an imperial decree that would reach every corner of the realm, a decree that not only shook the vast territories of the time, but also sent ripples through thousands of years of Chinese imperial history. In this decree, Emperor Wen of Han announced the total abolition of land taxes. For the first time, agricultural taxes were completely waived across the entire nation. This was not a momentary act of imperial whimsy. It became a fixed state policy that lasted for 12 years until the ascension of the next emperor in 156 BC. In an agrarian era where land taxes were the primary source of state revenue, the magnitude and impact of this policy were truly unprecedented. This remains the only recorded instance in thousands of years of Chinese history where a nationwide long-term tax exemption was successfully implemented. Later, powerful dynasties such as the Tang, Song, Ming and Qing occasionally granted small-scale or rotating tax breaks during their golden ages, but none ever achieved a nationwide, sustained and universal abolition of agricultural taxes. It would not be until the year 2006 that the Chinese government officially issued a document to permanently abolish the agricultural tax that had burdened Chinese farmers for over 2,600 years. How did Emperor Wen achieve this? Contrary to what one might expect, the total waiver of taxes was not driven by a fiscal deficit or deflation. In fact, while precise, quantifiable financial records from that era are scarce, the historical archives reveal an empire of immense affluence. By the time Emperor Wen's grandson, Han Wudi the Great, ascended the throne, it was said that copper coins in the imperial treasury were piled like mountains. The strings used to bind them had rotted away with age, leaving coins scattered across the floor, impossible to count. In the granaries, grain from one year was piled upon another. Old grain remained unconsumed as new harvests arrived. Eventually, the grain overflowed the warehouses and had to be stored in the open air, where it eventually rotted, becoming inedible. Why? And more importantly, how? Today, we introduce Liu Heng, known to history as Emperor Wen of Han. Posterity holds him in the highest esteem. Almost all historians and literati recognize him as the greatest sage king since the three dynasties, Xia, Shang and Zhou. He is seen as the only monarch to have truly mastered the great way of governance, serving as the benchmark for inner sageliness and outer kingliness. He perfectly embodied the literati's highest ideal of kingly politics. Subsequent enlightened rulers regarded him as the ultimate idol to emulate. Emperor Taizong of the Tang, while forging the reign of Zhenguan, constantly measured himself against Emperor Wen, often reflecting that his own virtue fell short. Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming dynasty, used Emperor Wen's frugality to lecture his officials. Even Emperor Kangxi of the Qing dynasty held him in profound veneration, admitting that his own philosophy of governance was modelled entirely after Emperor Wen. Throughout 2 millennia of imperial history, many mighty lords expanded borders, but only Emperor Wen displayed such profound restraint of power and compassion for the common people through his pure benevolent rule. He did not just lay the 400-year foundation for the Han Dynasty. He forged the highest moral totem of ancient Chinese politics. He is, without question, the teacher of 100 emperors. The Qin dynasty's unification of the 6 warring states relied on legalism, a meticulous and harsh legal system that turned the entire nation into a grinding machine. While this brought immense national power, it came at the cost of extreme exploitation of the populace. This was the primary reason for the Qin Empire's sudden collapse. As the saying goes, when things reach an extreme, they must reverse. During the rebellion against Qin and the subsequent Chu-Han contention, the Huanglao philosophy, which stood in direct opposition to legalism, gained significant traction. Its core tenet can be summarized in one phrase: governing by non-action, Wu Wei. This means following the natural laws and avoiding reckless interference, achieving a state where nothing is left undone through doing nothing. This guiding principle manifested in the policy of rest and recuperation, Xiuyang Shengqi, which Emperor Wen strictly followed after his ascension. In the 30 years between the death of the first emperor of Qin and the ascension of Emperor Wen, and indeed the 50 years if we include the wars of unification, total war was incessant. The result was a decimated population, a withered economy, and a collapsed society. When Liu Bang was proclaimed emperor at Dingtao and established the Han Dynasty, he inherited a scarred and broken mess. The Guanzhong heartland and the Central Plains were deathly desolate. Historical records state, "After great calamities, great plagues follow." Fields were barren and overgrown with weeds. Once ordered farmland became shrubland for foxes and rabbits. As the son of heaven, Liu Bang could not even find 4 horses of the same color to pull his imperial carriage. His ministers were often forced to travel to court in ox carts. This poverty was systemic. The 2/3 tax of the Qin had drained the people's last drop of blood, and the subsequent wars had wiped out the young workforce. At that time, it was recorded that people ate one another, and more than half the population perished. In the villages of the early Han, survivors were gaunt and pale, living in dilapidated mud huts without even basic farming tools. This extreme scarcity dictated that the early Han rulers had to adopt a stance diametrically opposed to that of the Qin. That stance was continuous, large-scale tax cuts. Objectively, the tax cuts began with Liu Bang, who set the land tax at 1/15, approximately 6.7%, far lower than the Qin. But Emperor Wen went further. In his second year, he cut it in half to 1/30, approximately 3.3%. 10 years later, he reduced it to 1/60, approximately 1.6%. Yet even this rate lasted less than a year. In his 13th year, 167 BC, he abolished the land tax entirely. This was not simple mercy. It was a profound economic gamble. Liu Heng and his ministers believed that if wealth remained in the hands of the imperial house, it would be squandered on grand palaces, costly expeditions, and meaningless rituals. But if wealth remained with the farmers, it would transform into reclaimed land, a growing population, and a more resilient social network. This logic of hiding wealth among the people would only find its theoretical resonance 2,000 years later in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Alongside tax cuts, he drastically reduced labor service to ensure people could focus on agriculture. Emperor Wen issued a decree changing the frequency of corvée labor from once a year to once every 3 years. Although this was achieved through multiple adjustments during his reign, such a low-frequency labor system was extremely rare in Chinese imperial history. Simultaneously, he delayed the age for entering labor and military service, the Fu status, from 15 or 17 to 20. To ensure the elderly were cared for and society remained stable, Emperor Wen issued a famous Decree on Caring for the Elderly in his second year, establishing a very specific system of physical subsidies. This was the first time in Chinese history that standards for elderly subsidies were codified into law. Those over 80 were given 1 dan of rice, 20 catties of meat, and 5 dao of wine per month. Those over 90 were additionally given 2 bolts of silk and 3 catties of cotton wadding. These subsidies had to be personally inspected and delivered by local officials to ensure they reached the recipients. For the Guan Gua Gu Du, the widower, the widow, the orphan and the childless, and the extremely impoverished, the emperor periodically ordered the distribution of silk, cotton, seeds, and food. These subsidies were typically issued during disaster years or specific festivals. While this was not a modern social security system under the production levels of the time, it was a social welfare policy that bypassed its era. Emperor Wen also emphasized the power of propaganda and leading by example. He personally ploughed the fields with the empress, who harvested mulberry leaves and wove silk to demonstrate the national policy of prioritizing agriculture. While such performances are common in modern politics, Liu Heng was sincere. Through his personal labor and early social welfare, he sought to rebuild a social contract based on warmth and respect, on soil long poisoned by legalist thought. However, governing a nation is not always about warmth and respect. Emperor Wen had to face reality. On one hand, he had to practice rest and recuperation to unbind the populace. On the other hand, the Xiongnu to the north were watching with predatory eyes, and hundreds of thousands of troops on the border needed to eat every day. Where would the money come from? Where would the grain go? Emperor Wen's most important minister, Cao Kuo, provided a solution that bordered on genius. Cao Kuo was not just a political theorist, he was an economist. Through a logically rigorous theory called valuing grain, he completed war mobilization, border fortification, and the redistribution of social wealth, all without increasing agricultural taxes or using the state treasury. The starting point of Cao Kuo's logic was a deep insight into the disconnect between law and reality. He pointed out that while the law highly praised agriculture, in reality merchants lived more luxuriously than princes by manipulating prices and exploiting high-interest loans. Conversely, the farmers, the foundation of the state, faced the low grain price hurting the farmer in bumper years and bankruptcy in disaster years, often forced to sell their land or even their children to pay the poll tax. This distortion was, in Cao Kuo's eyes, the empire's greatest security risk. To reverse this structural crisis, he guided Emperor Wen to make a crucial policy: turn political privilege into a commodity, thereby guiding private capital toward the areas where the state needed it most. This policy, known as input grain for titles, was brilliant because it precisely exploited the merchants' desperate desire for social mobility. In a strictly hierarchical society, merchants were wealthy but held no status and were always at risk of policy shifts. Cao Kuo suggested that the state openly sell noble ranks and the right to commute punishments, but the only accepted currency was grain. Furthermore, he required merchants to transport the grain directly to the northern border fortresses or designated state granaries. This single move solved three major dilemmas. First, the fiscal dilemma. The state gathered enough strategic reserves to face the Xiongnu without spending a single cent. Second, the logistics dilemma. In ancient times, grain transport losses could exceed 70%. But through this policy, merchants voluntarily and efficiently organized transport to gain status, shifting the cost entirely to the commercial class. Finally, the livelihood dilemma. Because wealthy merchants were frantically buying grain in the market to purchase ranks, it created a bull market, causing grain prices to rise. This allowed farmers with surplus grain to earn much more. They only needed to sell a small amount of grain to pay their taxes, significantly improving their quality of life. This was, in essence, a sophisticated redistribution of wealth. The government leveraged the greed of the rich to deliver benefits to the poor through the lever of grain prices. Ultimately, it was this policy that allowed Emperor Wen to abolish land taxes without collapsing the state treasury. Instead, it created the miracle of granaries so full that the grain rotted and became inedible. Emperor Wen and his ministers proved that a great statesman does not need to use violence to fill the treasury. They only need to precisely identify the social pain points and use them as a lever to move the staggering power of the people. This wisdom, turning private greed into public good, not only supported the material prosperity of the rule of Wen and Jing, but also set the fundamental paradigm for macro control in Chinese imperial society for the next 2,000 years. Wealth can solve many problems, but not all. In the development of an empire, external and internal conflicts are challenges that rulers must inevitably face. Often, the trajectory of these conflicts is beyond human will. A rising conqueror beyond the borders or an ambitious vassal prince within can become the fatal spark for war. Throughout the 23 years of Emperor Wen's reign, such threats were ever present. Yet, through supreme forbearance and political maneuvering, he minimized the possibility of conflict, securing a strategic opportunity window for the empire's rest and recuperation. He understood deeply that an empire newly emerged from the chaos of the late Qin and the tyranny of the Liu clan needed political resilience more than military conquest. In handling the thorny issue of Nanyue, Emperor Wen utilized soft power diplomacy to its fullest. Facing Zhao Tuo, who styled himself the martial emperor of Nanyue in open defiance of the central government, Wen did not mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops, as the Qin had done. Instead, he pinpointed his opponent's psychological soft spot. He ordered the meticulous care and ritual sacrifice at Zhao Tuo's ancestral tombs in Zhending, and granted high-ranking offices to Zhao Tuo's brothers residing in the interior. Subsequently, Wen personally penned a humble and moving letter, describing himself as of thin virtue, unwilling to see the people suffer, while subtly asserting the dignity of the universal sovereign. This combination of emotional diplomacy and political courtesy dismantled Zhao Tuo's defiance, leading him to voluntarily relinquish his imperial title and submit to the Han central government. This gambit, won without firing a single arrow, not only saved astronomical military expenses but prevented the Lingnan region from sinking back into a bloody quagmire. Against the Xiongnu, the most ferocious external threat from the north, Emperor Wen displayed a strategic patience rarely seen in history. Despite constant Xiongnu raids on the borders, some even reaching the outskirts of Chang'an, and a court filled with generals clamoring for war, Wen steadfastly adhered to the Heqin peace through marriage policy. At the time, many viewed this as a humiliation. But in Emperor Wen's ledger, this was a highly rational economic calculation. The cost of 1 year of war could support tens of thousands of families, while sending some silk, grain, and a princess bought years of relative border peace. He used this strategy of trading goods for time to win 2 to 3 precious decades of growth, allowing the people's granaries to slowly fill in silence. This perceived weakness was, in fact, a hardcore pragmatism. In managing internal conflicts, Emperor Wen was a master of balance. Facing vassal kings of the same imperial clan who held significant military power and threatened secession, he avoided aggressive vassal reduction, foreseeing that forced disarmament would lead to civil war. Instead, he employed subtler, gentler methods of differentiation and ritual governance. When the kings of Qi and Huainan showed signs of rebellion, he used the prestige of veteran generals like Zhou Bo and Guan Ying for deterrence, yet showed immense leniency toward the rebels themselves, even merely exiling Liu Chang, the king of Huainan, after his revolt. He masterfully navigated a triangular balance, using the veteran official group to check the vassal kings and using the existence of the vassals to dilute the authority of the veterans, while he himself remained above the fray, using benevolence as the final arbiter. This balance not only dissolved imminent armed conflicts, but also laid the logical groundwork for the later order of expanding favours, ensuring a peaceful transition of power. Emperor Wen's art of balance was also reflected in his restraint of his own power. By abolishing the crimes of defamation and monstrous speech, he voluntarily dismantled the walls blocking public opinion, allowing internal tensions an outlet rather than letting them build toward an explosion. He knew that the most stable rule was not making everyone feel afraid, but making everyone feel that the system was worth it. When he waived land taxes, issued elderly subsidies, and delayed labour service, he was essentially signing a peace contract with the people and the local elites. As long as everyone remained in their place, the state would no longer make demands. Beneath the shell of non-action, Wu Wei lay the most profound insight into social contradictions. With 23 years of patience, he transformed an empire that was a powder keg into a solid foundation. Under Wen's rule, military conflict was no longer the first choice but the last resort. This political logic, extinguishing war through diplomacy and dissolving internal strife through balance, not only provided the peaceful backdrop for the rule of Wen and Jing, but also set a benchmark of governance through intelligence that few successors could reach. Looking back from 2 millennia later, we realize that the wars that never happened were actually the heaviest medals Emperor Wen left for the Han. This restraint was the most prominent feature of Emperor Wen's character. Later, scholars and emperors repeatedly praised this virtue, believing that the control of oneself is far more important than the control of things. A story that has endured for 2,000 years best illustrates this. Emperor Wen once considered building a scenic platform in the palace called the Dew Terrace, Lu Tai. When he asked the craftsman for the cost, the reply was 100 pieces of gold. In the Han Dynasty, 100 gold pieces were roughly equivalent to the total assets of 10 middle-class households. Upon hearing this, Emperor Wen was silent for a long time, then spoke words that would make later dictators blush. "I have inherited the palaces of the late emperor and already feel ashamed of their grandeur. Why should I spend the wealth of 10 households just for a view?" He cancelled the project. This extreme personal frugality was not a performance, but a deep, stoic discipline. He wore coarse black silk, a fabric usually worn by commoners. His shoes were made of straw and his curtains were never decorated with embroidery. He even explicitly requested in his will that his mausoleum, Abolishing, contain no gold or silver burial goods, only pottery and wooden items. Furthermore, he forbade the mobilization of massive labor to build a high artificial mountain, insisting instead on building into the natural terrain to avoid damaging the landscape. Why was a man who commanded the wealth of an empire so stingy? Because Emperor Wen profoundly understood the negative externality of absolute power. In a centralized system, a tiny hobby of the emperor, amplified through layers of bureaucracy, becomes a heavy burden of labor on the common people. If the emperor likes expensive silk, the price of brocade nationwide skyrockets and countless farmers are forced to abandon their plows to weave. Through his personal parsimony, Emperor Wen placed a bridle on the greed of the entire empire. He proved that a ruler's greatness lies not in how much he possesses, but in how much he can refuse. This quality makes him remarkably similar to Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who, in his meditations, was constantly on guard against being corrupted by the imperial purple. Another standard Emperor Wen established for posterity was the emperor's own reverence for the law. This is exceedingly rare in an absolute monarchy. He promoted a judge, Minister of Justice, named Zhang Shiji, and the two engaged in several classic debates regarding power and rules. Once, during an imperial outing, a commoner suddenly ran out from under a bridge, startling the emperor's horses. Given the emperor's anger, he wished for the offender to be executed. However, Zhang Shiji only sentenced the man to a fine. Emperor Wen was furious, arguing that the man's actions had nearly cost him his life. Zhang Shiji calmly replied, "The law is the standard for all people under heaven, not a tool for the emperor's personal anger. If the law stipulates a fine for startling horses, but you kill him out of personal emotion, how can the people ever trust the law again?" After a long silence, Emperor Wen accepted the verdict. On another occasion, someone stole a jade ring from the temple of the founding Emperor Gaozu. Emperor Wen demanded the execution of the thief's entire clan. Zhang Shiji insisted on the death penalty for the individual alone, without implicating relatives. Zhang Shiji asked the emperor, "If stealing a jade ring warrants the extermination of a clan, then what heavier punishment would you have left if someone were to desecrate the tomb of Emperor Gaozu himself?" Emperor Wen was once again persuaded by this cold, hard logic. This respect for judicial independence was, in fact, Emperor Wen building a wall for the long-term stability of the empire. He knew that if the law became a toy for the emperor's whims, the empire would lose its foundational stability. Through these cases, he sent a signal to the entire bureaucracy. Even the Son of Heaven must exercise power within the framework of rules. This spirit echoes the "law is above the king" principle, later advocated in the Magna Carta of Western civilization. Yet, Emperor Wen was not a cold legalist. In 167 BC, the same year he abolished land taxes, history records another dramatic event. A famous physician from Qi named Chunyu Yi was involved in a lawsuit and sentenced to mutilation punishment, corporal punishment, to be sent to Chang'an for sentencing. Chunyu Yi had no sons, only 5 daughters. Upon his departure, he lamented in despair, "Having daughters instead of sons is useless when a crisis strikes." His youngest daughter, Jing, a simple young woman, was deeply moved by her father's despair. She braved the long journey to accompany him to Chang'an and submitted a petition to Emperor Wen. Jing wrote, "Once a person is executed, they cannot be brought back to life. Once a person is mutilated, the body cannot be made whole again. Even if they wish to turn over a new leaf, the law leaves them no path. I beg to be taken as a state slave, to trade my freedom for my father's physical integrity so that he may have a chance to reform." This expression of filial piety and simple legal reasoning, rooted in the depths of humanity, struck Emperor Wen's heart. But as a ruler, his reflection went deeper. He realized that while the dignity of the law must be maintained, should it not also incorporate human concern? The terror-based laws inherited from the Qin were efficient, but they cast the punished outside the social system forever. A man with his nose cut off can never live as a normal citizen again. His only path is to become an enemy of society. This was a primitive, retributive logic that focused only on destruction, not restoration. Consequently, Emperor Wen issued a revolutionary decree abolishing corporal mutilation throughout the empire. He replaced punishments that damaged the body with fixed terms of labor and bastinado, flogging. This was the first time in human history that a supreme ruler explicitly proposed a legal reform replacing destruction and isolation with education and restoration. Through this reform, Emperor Wen elevated the Han law from a tool of terror to an art of governance. He made the people feel that the law was no longer a monster in the shadows ready to cut off their noses or feet, but a system of rules That, while strict, allowed for redemption. This de-violation of the law was the key psychological foundation for the Han Empire's long-term stability. In 157 BC, Liu Heng, Emperor Wen of Han, felt the approach of death. In his final moments, he did not seek immortality like the first emperor of Qin, nor did he build a colossal mausoleum like his grandson, Emperor Wu. He left a final testament that has moved historians for generations. He wrote, "Though my virtue is modest, I have reigned for 23 years. By the grace of heaven and earth, the world is at peace. My greatest concern is that my passing will cause the people grief. I command that after my death, the mourning rituals must be shortened to the absolute minimum. Do not forbid the people from weeping, but they must remove their mourning clothes after 3 days. Do not forbid marriages, do not forbid sacrifices, and do not forbid the drinking of wine or the eating of meat." In that era, the death of an emperor usually meant the grinding halt of the nation's social and economic life. Through this will, Emperor Wen minimized the imperial house's final intrusion into the lives of the people. He refused to become a burden to his subjects, even in his departure. He was buried at Abolishing. According to his wishes, there was no lavish underground palace, only simple pottery and stone gates that blended into the mountains. After his death, his son, Emperor Jing, inherited his low taxes, frugality, and restraint. Together they forged the rule of Wen and Jing. It was the unimaginable national strength accumulated by these 2 generations that allowed Emperor Wu to launch the grand expeditions that would reshape the map of Asia over the following half-century. Why does Emperor Wen remain a teacher of 100 emperors? Because he solved one of the most difficult propositions in the history of civilization: how a ruler manages his own desires. He proved that a powerful nation does not need to be built upon the suffering of its people, and a sacred monarch does not need to rely on hypocritical grand narratives. With straw shoes, a 1/30th tax rate, and an ear turned to the plea of a young girl, he set the tone for Eastern political ethics. For a global audience, Emperor Wen's story is more than a footnote in Chinese history, it is a philosophical reflection on leadership. In today's world of noise, expansion, and rampant consumerism, this Chinese emperor from 2,000 years ago, who wore coarse cloth, stopped at the edge of a scenic terrace, and maintained a reverence for the law, still teaches the simplest and most profound lesson. True greatness comes from restraint. The most enduring power comes from the refusal of power. This was Emperor Wen, a mortal who died 2,000 years ago and a teacher who will never be out of date.